Iranian hardliners have long mocked their foreign minister, Mohammad Javad Zarif, as the make-believe American, after a character in a comic Iranian movie who puts on an accent, wardrobe, and lifestyle to live out a fantasy of American life. A resident of the United States on and off for nearly 30 years, Mr. Zarif was the Iranian most closely associated with the negotiation of the 2015 deal that limited Iran's nuclear program in exchange for relief from sweeping economic sanctions. To ordinary Iranians and reformists, that made him a hero. To hardliners, though, he was a dupe, seduced by the West into a deal that the Americans would never live up to. Now, with the nuclear deal on the brink of collapse, with the Trump administration reimposing crushing sanctions on Iran, and with Tehran threatening to restart elements of its nuclear program, Mr. Zarif is coming under renewed fire not only from hardliners in Tehran but also from Washington. White House officials say that President Trump has requested sanctions specifically against the Iranian foreign minister, stirring debate in both countries about the administration's intentions. Hawks like Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and John R. Bolton, the National Security Advisor, argue that Mr. Zarif's American affectations are what make him dangerous. Mr. Zarif and his patron, President Hassan Rouhani, are polished frontmen for the Ayatollah's international con artistry, Mr. Pompeo has said, suggesting that the foreign minister uses his flawless, idiomatic American English as a ruse to mask his allegiance to the hardline agenda of Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khomeini. But critics shoot back that threatening Iran's top diplomat makes no sense, given Mr. Trump's repeated insistence that his ultimate goal is to restart negotiations with Iran. Cutting off the intermediary for any such talks, the critics say, may ultimately leave the administration no choice other than confrontation. It just makes it harder or impossible for the Iranians to choose some kind of diplomacy, said Jeff Prescott, a former senior director for Iran on the National Security Council under President Barack Obama. In an extensive email exchange, Mr. Zarif said he felt little personal risk from American sanctions. Everyone who knows me knows that I or my family do not own any property outside Iran, he wrote. I personally do not even have a bank account outside Iran. Iran is my entire life and my sole commitment. So I have no personal problem with possible sanctions. Washington, Mr. Zarif argued, would only be hurting itself by cutting him off. The only impact, and possibly the sole objective, of a possible designation would be to limit my ability to communicate. And I doubt that would serve anyone, he wrote. Certainly it would limit the possibility of informed decision-making in Washington. As for the allegation of con artistry, Mr. Zarif said that he never asked the Americans to trust him and he never trusted them either, least of all during the negotiations of the nuclear deal, known formally as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Contrary to public statements by its detractors on all sides, JCPOA was not built on trust, Mr. Zarif wrote in the email, referring to the agreement. It was indeed based on explicit recognition of mutual mistrust. That is why it is so long and detailed. Mr. Zarif's status in Tehran has already suffered severely with the waning fortunes of the nuclear deal. After pulling out of the agreement last year, the Trump administration in May tightened its sanctions to penalize anyone in the world who seeks to buy Iranian oil, slashing Iranian exports and plunging the economy into a tailspin. Mr. Khomeini has said without naming Mr. Zarif or Mr. Rouhani that those who persuaded him to negotiate with Washington had made a grave mistake. Other hardliners have argued that Mr. Zarif should now resign, face impeachment, or be put on trial for the crime of leading Iran into an agreement that dismantled years of nuclear research and investment for no ultimate benefit. Mr. Zarif and his government put all their eggs in the basket of foreign policy and the nuclear deal, Abdul Reza Davari, a conservative advisor to Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, the former Iranian president, said in a telephone interview from Tehran. It has been a spectacular failure, and now they are hanging on life support, hoping a change of administration in the U.S. would save them. Iranian officials have often said that they have sought only peaceful uses of nuclear power, not a nuclear weapon, a claim widely disputed in the West. But with the 2015 deal now all but dead, many conservatives in Tehran are pushing for Iran to resume its programs for the enrichment of nuclear material as a sign of strength, Mr. Davari said. Some in his hardline faction remain open to negotiations with Mr. Trump, Mr. Davari said, but no longer through Mr. Zarif. Mr. Zarif briefly resigned in February after conservatives in the Iranian military failed to include him in a visit to Tehran by the president of Syria. Mr. Khomeini interceded to keep Mr. Zarif at work. By email, Mohammad Javad Zarif discusses his hopes for the nuclear deal, as well as his own future. Iranian moderates, while defending Mr. Zarif, are also preparing political eulogies. "We have never had a foreign minister like Zarif in the history of Iran," said Mustafa Tajadeh, a prominent reformist politician. What he achieved with the nuclear deal, gaining the trust of both Americans and Mr. Khomeini, was nothing short of a miracle. At the top echelons of the Iranian political system, where knowledge of the United States is generally shallow and suspicions run deep, Mr. Zarif stands out for his ease among Americans. He came to the United States at 17 to attend college, and was an undergraduate at San Francisco State University in 1979 when the Islamic Revolution broke out in Tehran. He pitched in by helping lead a group of student revolutionaries who took over the Iranian consulate in San Francisco. He remained in the United States, first as a student and then as a diplomat, for much of his adult life. With his command of American English, he comes off to Westerners as urbane and at times even wry. Seriously, he quipped this week by Twitter, quoting a White House news release claiming that even before the deal's existence, Iran was violating its terms. His friends say he prefers American coffee to the typical Iranian tea, and he also enjoys dining out in American restaurants, although he is careful never to allow himself to be photographed in a setting where alcohol is visible, which the hardliners could use against him at home in Tehran. American supporters of imposing sanctions on Mr. Zarif argue that his effectiveness at passing for one of their countrymen is what makes him so dangerous. It helps him hide the fundamentally anti-American and expansionist character of the government he serves, they say. "I would call him the whitewasher in chief," said Ruel Mark Gerecht, a fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies and a former CIA official who studies Iran. Zarif has gotten away, almost, with murder, because he has been depicted as something he is not, a moderate, when he is totally loyal to the supreme leader and totally loyal to the revolution. Mr. Gerecht added that the sanctions would send a message to the American public about Mr. Zarif and his patron, Mr. Rouhani. "It is important to the narrative, to dispatch the notion that Zarif or Rouhani is part of this moderate wing that will bring about normalcy," Mr. Gerecht said. But Mr. Zarif, in an email, said that the issue of the moment was not about him or the Iranian government, but about the nuclear deal, which he said was never intended to resolve all our differences. "It was negotiated by all with open eyes about what is possible and what was not," he wrote, "and it remains the best possible agreement on the nuclear issue." As for the hardliners who deride him as Mamal Emrki, the make-believe American, Mr. Zarif said he had never seen the movie. "But I do not mind if people have a good laugh about me," he added. "That is another way of making myself useful."